It is wonderful to see all of your beautiful faces in IRL, in real life. Welcome to the Walrus Talks, What's Next, presented by Concordia University. I'm Jennifer Hollett. I'm the Executive Director of the Walrus, and I'm your host for this evening. And wow, this is just so exciting to be back in Toronto with the talks and feel the energy in the room, but also a hello to the over 300 people registered who are joining us online via live stream across Canada and beyond. We have a hashtag tonight, and it's an opportunity to share the Walrus Talks with a larger audience, but also to connect the audiences for those who are in the room and those of you who are online. So feel free to tag us at the Walrus and use the hashtag Walrus Talks. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that we're on in Toronto, Toronto. We're gathered within the bounds of Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we are honored to carry on a tradition of storytelling. We encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the land and your connection to it, and for those joining us online, wherever you are in the world. A bit about the Walrus. The Walrus started 19 years ago, really as an optimistic project. And we're best known for our journalism, available in print, but also online at thewalrus.ca. By podcast, our latest podcast is The Deep Dive. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts. But also with events like this one, the Walrus Talks. And the goal is to generate conversation, to spark ideas. We recognize that these conversations are complex and necessary, and more than ever important that we're listening to each other, that we're connecting at a time of great polarization, at a time where many of us were isolated and didn't have the opportunity to come together. And that's a big part of why we're here today, to ask, what's next? So thank you for joining us and being a part of the Walrus. Our work is powered by our donors, our supporters, and our partners. So a big thank you to Concordia University for making tonight's event possible. Concordia has supported many iterations of the Walrus Talks over the years. I'm also a proud Concordia grad, and actually just last night I was in Montreal, back at Concordia, moderating a discussion on media manipulation, specifically looking at meme wars, misinformation, and disinformation. And I appreciate the clap because, yeah, we need to be talking about these things, as well as the role of an organization like the Walrus, which is committed to independent, fact-based Canadian journalism. Concordia's programs really prepare alumni to be at the forefront of innovation. And being back at Concordia, just seeing the educators, the students, the research, it's ultimately devoted to creating a better world. So to tell us more, please welcome Concordia University's President and Vice Chancellor, Graham Carr.
Thanks, Jennifer. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here. Great to see you all. Thanks for coming out. Spectacular day here in Toronto. And of course, it's just wonderful, isn't it, to be doing things in person. If you don't know Concordia University, we're obviously located in Montreal, as Jennifer said. We're a university with a little over 50,000 students coming from more than 155 countries around the world. And we think that that diversity of our student population is part of what makes us an innovative next-gen university. That's our aspiration. Of course, I realize that I'm here with you tonight on the campus of one of the world's truly great universities, the University of Toronto. But I'd like to believe, in fact, more than like to believe, I know that Concordia adds luster to Canada's higher education profile around the world. We have this year, for the third year in a row, been named by QS Rankings in London, England, as the top university under 50 years old not just in Canada, but in all of North America. And many of you will probably know that we have the largest and best fine arts faculty in Canada, that we have an MBA program which is ranked 75th in the world, that we are leaders in a number of research areas that are pretty distinctive in a university environment in Montreal, which is very crowded. So we're leaders of a national cybersecurity consortium. We have leadership in the fields of cinema, synthetic biology studies. We really believe that Concordia is positioning itself as a next-gen university. We used to have the tagline, real education for the real world, and we want to make that work-integrated learning piece a big offer for our students going forward as well. 2 weeks ago, the Times Higher Education rankings came out, and they ranked about 1,500 universities worldwide on the work that they were doing to address the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm incredibly proud to say that Concordia ranked 48th in the world for the work that we are doing to reduce inequality, 20th in the world for the work we're doing on climate action, and 5th in the world for the work that we're doing on smart cities and communities. And I think those, yes, you can please. I think those areas of research are really pertinent to tonight's conversation about what's next. Of course, I realize that for a large percentage of people in Toronto, the question, what's next, is followed by the answer, Game 6. But with the Walrus, Concordia is interested in deepening the conversation toward other issues about the big issues confronting the world. And tonight, with this tremendous group of speakers, are two of our faculty members, of whom we're incredibly proud. Shannon Lloyd, whom you'll meet in a moment, from the John Molson School of Business and the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. And Shannon's area of research activity is to look at how corporations align with the climate challenges or the climate objectives of the Paris Accord. And Fenwick McKelvey, whom you'll also meet in a few moments, who's from our Department of Communication Studies and looks at the influence of the internet on society, and is also the co-director with one of his colleagues from computer science of a new Institute for Applied AI that Concordia has just created. So we're very proud to be partners with the Walrus. We're super proud of Jen Hollett, one of our graduates, and like I keep telling her, the value of her degree keeps going up every single day. So thanks again for being here, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you so much, Graham. I was saying to Graham backstage that what a cool, down-to-earth president, and that's what I love about Concordia, is it's that balance of theory and practice, right? It's the big brains, but it's putting that out in the world and in the community. So the pandemic. Yeah. It's a difficult one to talk about. I find it's even tricky when someone says, "How are you doing?" Do you say fine? Do you say healthy? Do you say it's the worst? I think my hairdresser said it well. Hey, yeah, you know. He's a Newfoundlander. Yeah, you know. I thought that was an honest answer. I think throughout the pandemic, as much in the first week back in March 2020, as well as now, it's like, what on earth? What now? What next? And while it's been incredibly challenging, and there's been an intersectionality of all the issues we've been facing, there's also been an opportunity for all of us as individuals, as families and communities, but as a larger community to say, we have to do better. Let's take a look at what's going on and what's going wrong, because there's a lot of it, and let's figure out how we can come out of this in a better place. We must be able to learn something, a lot of the things, from the pandemic. So what's next? That's the question we dare to ask and answer tonight. What's next for Canada? Tonight, we'll be hearing from an incredible lineup of speakers, academics, journalists, advocates, and thinkers about their thoughts on what's next. For those of you who are new to the Walrus Talks, here's how it works. Each speaker has 7 minutes. This will be followed by a reception just outside, which you're all invited to, where we'll carry on the conversation with the speakers. Tonight, we'll be hearing from culture writer for BuzzFeed News, author of the new memoir coming out soon, Son of Elsewhere, and host of CBC pop culture podcast Pop Chat, Elamin Abdelmahmoud, associate professor and co-director of the Applied Artificial Intelligence Institute at Concordia University, Dr. Fenwick McKelvey, assistant professor at the John Molson School of Business at Concordia University, Dr. Shannon Lloyd, vice president of public engagement at Canadian Women's Foundation, Andrea Gunraj, editor-in-chief of The Walrus, Jessica Johnson, and chief of Cowessess First Nation, Chief Cadmus Delorme. And you'll see on the program we did have a 7th speaker, journalist Stephen Marr. Unfortunately, he's sick. As our event producer joked, "Stay home, we don't want you here." But in all seriousness, we're glad he's taking good care, and we hope that he gets better soon. Thank you all for joining us.
Oof, real people. Hi, everybody. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. I'm a culture writer for BuzzFeed News. I'm really delighted to be with you today. And let me begin by telling you the year I was born. I was born in the year 1988. Good year, solid year. I don't have any particular memories of that time. But the reason I'm starting there is because I was 1 when the Berlin Wall fell. I was 3 when the Soviet Union collapsed. I was also 3 when Nirvana's Nevermind came out, but I don't know, that's neither here nor there. But I'm starting there because 2 years before I was born, the German sociologist Ulrich Beck wrote a book called Risk Society. And Beck was kind of frustrated with this trend of calling everything post, okay? We'll get to what's next in a minute. I have a clock here, but it is lying, because I'm just gonna go way over time. It's gonna be great. Okay, so Ulrich Beck was frustrated with this trend of calling everything post. He was like, everything can't be post. Post-war, post-industrial, post-everything, post-modern. And he said, look, post is a definition that is necessarily negative. It doesn't actually define the age that we live in. And instead, he sort of sought to sort of give us some kind of grounding for what they were living through at the time, this era of great war, great power conflict. And the term that he came up with is risk society. Risk society is sort of dictating that everyone is living in a world where they're trying to figure out how to manage their own personal risk in relationship to other people, other countries, other people in their community. And the reason I was thinking of Ulrich Beck is that we appear to have found ourselves in that world. Because of the pandemic, yes, but also because of some stuff that we put ourselves through. Namely, we are in a moment of low trust in media, low trust in institutions, low trust in government. The pandemic did not begin these trends, but it certainly accelerated them. And we have found ourselves in a moment where masks and vaccines have become a way for us to evaluate whether another person is risky to us or not. It's going to be interesting, I think, for us to remember this moment in time 10, 20 years down the road where maybe we were quick to judge people, but maybe we were quick to judge people specifically based on what they did when they were the most scared they'd ever been. And that really resonated with me because I think our pop culture kind of reflected this. Our pop culture really reflected we've been living in a moment for some time of really fragmented pop culture. So for example, a lot of people are sort of consuming different news sources. We don't know the same things in common. That's sort of starting to become more and more frequent in that way. And that's, for me, an interesting question because then I sort of begin to look at, well, what are the things that we're gravitating to together? And during the pandemic, we really accelerated this trend of everybody's watching different shows. Nobody's watching the same thing together. Nobody's consuming the same kind of pop culture. Pop culture that I grew up on used to be that we all watched the same thing on the same night. Thursday was Friends night, okay? You didn't do anything else on Thursday because you had to catch up on, like, I don't know what Ross and Rachel were doing. But we kind of find ourselves in a moment where everybody's watching different things at different paces, and they're not consuming the same pop culture moments, and therefore not having the same kind of catharsis. And what shows were breaking through, it appeared to me, were shows that dealt with history. This is interesting. Shows that dealt with history, but not necessarily history that was long in the past, just history that's relatively modern, but they wanted to reframe it. For example, how many of you saw one of the, 87 million Britney Spears documentaries? Anybody? Yeah, too many of them. Nobody needs that many. But we wanted to sort of relitigate that moment. We wanted to relitigate that in sort of recent history that we all shared and think about it from a different perspective. And I think that's what those documentaries did. There was also the Chernobyl show. We also saw the Pam and Tommy show. I don't know how many of you guys watched it. It's pretty good. You should do it. It's good. But the real point that I'm trying to make is that, like, we seem to be living through this moment that is the You're Wrong Aboutification of culture. You're Wrong About is a very good podcast that sort of takes an event that happened in the past and then says, everything you know about this thing is actually wrong. And so much of the pop culture we're consuming right now is taking that concept and saying, look, you thought you knew Britney Spears, but you don't. And making you go through the motions of recognizing that actually there's more to the story. And I think that's interesting. But what's more interesting to me is, why are these the shows? Why are these the shows that are breaking through? Why are these the shows that people want to talk about regularly? And I'm one of those people who, I'm a culture writer for a living. That means I have the very joyful job of trying to think through, hey, everybody's talking about this show. Why is that the thing? Sometimes that means spending the whole day watching a television show and being like, I don't like it. It's pretty good, you should try it. But the real point that I want to get to, right, is that because these shows are talking about recent history, they're also talking about contested history. They're all talking about, history that we remember just a little bit differently. And we want to have a fight about it. We want to say, you know what, we remember this thing in this way. We remember the way we treated Britney Spears in a different way. We were having the celebrity commentators at the time who put many of the young women through the ringer, through incredibly sexist coverage. And they are having to speak for themselves and saying, that's how everybody was talking. And we get to sort of sit on our own sort of moral high ground and say, you know what? I wasn't doing that back then. It's not true. Everybody was doing it. That's sort of the thing about history, is that we seem to sort of smooth over the uncomfortable parts of it. But the reason I wanted to talk about this is that I used to work on a TV show. The agenda was Steve Paikin, TVO, and he did a whole sort of series about a central question, okay? And the question was this: what do we need to know in common? What is the thing that all of us need to know in common? And it's a question that I think about a lot, specifically because if we push it one step further, then the question becomes, what do we need to know in common in order for us to become a we? What is the bare minimum amount of information that we need to consume in order for us to maintain some kind of we? Because if we are all living in different worlds, consuming different news, having different moral relationships to the different pieces of news that we're consuming, that idea of a we begins to fray relatively quickly. Ooh, are you sure about this clock? Oh, wow, okay. And as I think through that question, I think that's what's next, right? I think that is what's next, is that maybe the reason that these are the shows that are breaking through, maybe the reason that these are the shows bucking the trend of, the loss of the monoculture, the idea that we all used to watch the same shows and we stopped, and then now these are the shows that are breaking through. Maybe that's what's next. Maybe the next thing that we need to figure out together is, what is our version of this contested history, the history that we're living through right now? I'm excited about that because it also means that we get to turn to historians, historically a rambunctious bunch who want to share a lot of information, and very few people are listening to them, but they're like, this is our moment. And so I'm excited for the era of historians to begin. I think we need historians more than we've ever needed them to explain to us these moments that we're living through, but also to help us understand how we not make the same mistakes again. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Fenwick McKelvey. The metaverse became a lot more real for me when my local diner joined it. The place is not exactly high-tech. I expect to pay in cash. So I was surprised that the owner would buy into a future built on cryptocurrency by purchasing a small tract of virtual property that you could visit online. Even better if you had virtual reality goggles. With its plot in the metaverse, also known as Web3, the owner hoped that customers would eat food in its online restaurant. Now, how you'd be able to eat food while wearing VR goggles is for another talk. For now, what I'd like to talk about is how the metaverse became a lot more personal for me. By buying the plot, my Montreal diner was sharing the same future as Facebook, or now Meta, who introduced the term metaverse to sell us a future where we live as digital avatars, working and playing in the company's private domain. This is where my beloved diner parted ways with me, by joining what I think is a careless way to imagine society with technology, the corporate metaverse, and missing a clear alternative, what I'll describe as the commons. We've forgotten about the commons. That's something that's become obvious for me through my collaborations with our research group, Machine Agencies at the Milieu Institute, looking into what a commons could be like for artificial intelligence. And today I'm happy to announce that we've launched our first report, Imagining an AI Commons, to coincide with this talk. The commons is a way to describe that which we share, our ways to communicate, our being together. It's also a vision of public good, public participation, something we should share and care for. 2 years into our pandemic, the commons feels very virtual, but it's very real. Public networks, shared software, everything that seems to go wrong when you're on a Zoom call, those are the commons that we depend upon every day. And we used to talk about the commons all the time when the internet was first imagined. It was thought to be an information commons. But now all that collaboration and cooperation that keeps the actual internet online is being bypassed by this talk of the metaverse. The metaverse is built on certain assumptions that run counter to the very possibility of public good. It's trying to build, or rather rebuild, our world around absolute ownership and property, all tracked on one blockchain or another. The motivation comes from an underlying distrust of the common good. Without property, the story goes, humans would ruin shared resources, so we cannot have public goods. That's the argument for the tragedy of the commons. The metaverse is something of the tragedy of the commons, when we can only imagine our future intractably caught up in property rights and virtual real estate scams like the one that my local diner has fallen prey to, just as it survived the pandemic. You know, the metaverse is a lot of things. The terms that describe the metaverse, blockchain, non-fungible tokens, and all those other things. These terms matter less than the underlying proposal to use technology to rebuild society. But it should be the other way around. What's missing too much when we imagine our futures is that we let them be technical rather than social. For every pitch of a new technology now, what's really being proposed is a vision for our society. Technologies demand power, politics, and commons to use them. The challenge for us is not to build a new virtual world, but to imagine a better world with the one we have now. Flipping thinking of technology as speculative to one about thinking about relations, something that I better understand as I learn more about indigenous epistemologies to technology. Unlike the virtual nature of the metaverse, the commons is a call to think about the land, the power, the data, the people, the things. Even for those who are familiar with my past work on internet demons, all those technologies that enable artificial intelligence, fantasies like the metaverse. Right now, for example, work being done by the Milieu Solar Media Group is experimenting with solar power and what it means to build technology that matches the Earth's cycles. They are building solar-powered servers, maybe solar-powered Game Boys, to make technology fit the better world that we have. I want to argue that we can have nice things, that we can have a commons, one that demands cooperation to be effectively managed, public governance and public investment. That's part of my hope for Concordia's new Applied AI Institute, to think about the applied part of AI as the beginning, not the end, to imagine better worlds first, then applications. That's why the commons is both part of what's been past and what's next. We can't let our conversations about thinking about the common good and what we need to do to support it be derailed by another round of investor talks and get-rich-quick pitches. We are at a critical time to build public digital infrastructure, to invest in our commons, to see the true value of technology as community, which might seem a lot pretty far away from my local diner, but I'm much more interested in my neighborhood block than the blockchain at these days. Thank you very much, and thanks to Harry and Wallace for watching.
Good evening. My name is Shannon Lloyd, and I'm a professor of management at the John Molson School of Business. Before becoming a professor, I was a sustainability consultant. After more than a decade of working with diverse clients in many industries, I became very discouraged about the outcomes of my work. I'll give you an example. A colleague and I had been hired by a major food distribution company to assess the life cycle environmental impact of their product. We collected data, built models, and assessed the environmental impact of food production, food distribution, and food preparation. Our client's operations, the distribution of food, had a significant climate impact. But the climate impact of food production and food preparation were quite a bit larger. The client highlighted our study in their annual sustainability report. But rather than focusing on how they could and would reduce their impact, they simply used our findings to emphasize that their operations accounted for a small percentage of the overall energy impact. And that was that. Several months of data collection and analysis to say, relative to everyone else, we're doing pretty good. This practice of relative comparisons is common and problematic. Comparing the environmental impact of companies or products can perhaps be helpful in understanding which environmental options are least harmful, but they don't tell us if a company or product is sustainable. This framework of who does more or less harm is not the path to a healthy and stable planet. What we need, and what we're starting to see, are methods for determining the amount of environmental impact allowable given Earth's environmental limits. Among these methods are science-based targets, a new approach in which companies voluntarily set emission targets aligned with the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, which is to halt global temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius. My research team has been investigating companies' use of science-based targets. My conclusion? Science-based targets are a good starting point, but in their current form, they are not enough. First, there's not enough transparency. Science-based targets are calculated using mathematical formulas that represent different ways of allocating allowable emissions to individual companies. These formulas reflect different underlying assumptions and different socio-political choices. It's not clear how the methods were selected, who had a say in selecting the methods, or what assumptions companies make when they use the methods to set targets. This makes it difficult to understand whose interests are represented, and more importantly, whose interests are not represented in these methods. And it makes it difficult to determine whether science-based targets set by individual companies will collectively align with the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. Second, science-based targets rely too much on greenwashing. This term, greenwashing, describes the hope that certain actions will make the world more sustainable, when in reality they fall short. Let's take the example of renewable energy certificates. Say a company uses electricity produced from fossil fuels. They can then purchase the right to claim low or zero emissions from renewable energy used by someone else. Yes, companies can actually claim emission reductions against their science-based targets by buying renewable energy certificates. This is allowed because we have collectively assumed that the sale of these certificates will trigger more investment in renewable energy and eventually reduce the emissions somewhere else. I really wish this were the case, but unfortunately there's no evidence to support this assumption. Science-based targets will not make companies Paris-aligned if they continue to claim emission reductions that are not real. Third, not enough companies are setting science-based targets. Large companies get a lot of attention when they set science-based targets, but are all companies following suit? As of last week, nearly 1,400 companies had set science-based targets. This is a small number compared to the tens or hundreds of millions of companies across the globe. But companies that set science-based targets tend to be large. In fact, we estimate that these 1,400 companies are collectively responsible for 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's big, but it's not big enough. Science-based targets are set voluntarily, so companies likely set a target if there's a business case to do so. I'm excited to say that 22 Canadian companies have set science-based targets, and 30 Canadian companies have committed to setting a target. But who's missing from this list? I'll give you a few Canadian examples. There's a list called the Carbon Majors that identifies the 100 companies responsible for more than 70% of global industrial greenhouse gas emissions. 4 Canadian companies are on this list. This includes 3 oil and gas companies, Suncor Energy, Canadian Natural Resources, and Husky Energy, and 1 mining company, Teck Resources Limited. To my knowledge, none of these companies have set science-based targets. We see the same pattern globally. More companies, in particular the largest polluters, must set targets to collectively meet the goal of the Paris Agreement. So what's next? Companies have been voluntarily measuring and reporting greenhouse gas emissions and talking about their climate action for decades. Yet the climate crisis persists. In fact, the latest reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change paint a dire picture. Without comprehensive policy and massive action immediately, we could be heading toward a global average increase of 3 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. Each fraction of a degree means more damage and loss to nature and humans. Science-based targets are a promising development. They can play a role in accelerating our transition to a low-carbon future if there's more transparency, less greenwashing, and aggressive target setting by the most polluting companies. But make no mistake, science-based targets are currently voluntary. And voluntary initiatives are not enough. What we need are policymakers in Canada and across the globe who will take action now to hold companies to account. Thank you.
Okay, that's better. One woman says, "My role as a single mother tripled as I managed 3 kids under the age of 15 from home and tried to sustain a consistent paycheck." Another says the cost of living and housing and food affects my ability to leave an unhealthy marriage. It affects quality of life for my kids and myself. Another, "I'm at my limit. There's too much expected of people with dependents. You're burning out an entire generation of people." And this, "After 20 years of working in healthcare, the last 2 years in my field of work has become detrimental to my health." These are just some of the women and gender diverse people struggling today with caregiving work. They join the 44% of mothers who 2 years into a pandemic with gendered impacts say they're reaching their breaking point. My name is Andrea Gunraj, and I work with the Canadian Women's Foundation, a national leader in the movement for gender equality and justice. And I'm here to tell you that I believe our future depends on transforming the way we value care work. The story is actually a very old one. Our society is built on women's unpaid and underpaid care work, at the same time that it is founded on stolen land and stolen labor. Gendered care is a presumed sacrifice that we bank on. It keeps our households, our communities, and our cities running. It underlies the smooth function of the places where we live, work, and play. It carries us through life as we face all kinds of challenges. The story of women's care is written as a difficult one, a journey of underappreciated sacrifice for the greater good. We've built our laws and our policies and institutions on the assumption and requirement that women, particularly racialized and marginalized women, will be there to perform free and undervalued nurturing, education, health, and life support for children and elders and families and adults and romantic partners and coworkers and the public at large. This is a narrative of inherent and natural duty. We see it at home. Girls and women perform the bulk of unpaid childcare, elder care, and housework. Things are slowly changing, but the duties are by no means gender balanced. We see it in our economy. Over half of women workers are in the 5 C's. That's caring, catering, clerical work, cashiering, and cleaning. Most of these jobs are set up to be precarious, pressure-laden, underprotected, and poorly compensated, and they're dominated by immigrant, racialized, and marginalized women. In these roles, of course, women have been in the forefront of the pandemic, but they have had little say in decision-making in the pandemic response. We see it at work. So much of women's time is taken up with unpaid work, so they have less time for paid work, and the paid work they do is not well compensated. Women also get penalized for parenthood. Think of the motherhood penalty, where women lose advancement opportunities because they become parents. Compare that to the fatherhood bonus, where men's compensation tends to bump up when they become parents. And in the workplace, who feels the pressure to do diversity and inclusion initiatives off the side of their desks? Who takes care of staff socials and celebrations? It's the lowest paid women, racialized women, and 2S LGBTQ employees. We see it in our communities as well. Women and girls are most likely to volunteer their time in Canada. 80% of charity workers and nonprofit workers in Canada also identify as women. Now, this is not a case against care. Paid and unpaid, it is essential and formative to our humanity. There's not one of us who doesn't benefit from it on a daily basis. But this is a case for valuing care work, highly valuing it. As the pandemic evolves, one of the most radical innovations we can pursue is to uplift care work, and most importantly, uplift and value and support the diverse women and two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people who have been doing it all along. What if they were paid for their unpaid elder care, child care, community care, and home care? What if they were paid excellently for 5C jobs? What if these were set up to be the best professions and not the most hard, the most draining, and thankless? What if migrant care workers had an automatic and clear path to settlement and citizenship? What if women and gender diverse people weren't teetering on the brink of poverty as they did care work? What if it wasn't a struggle? In the last 2 years, of course, recognition of essential work trended. We applauded essential workers as heroes. What if we moved forward with real vision to give care work its due as essential and take care of the carers? Not just because we're virtuous, but because we understand the enormous social and human and economic benefits of doing it. Those of us who advocate for gender justice, we're pushing for 3 things to happen as a start. We need to make care work, excellent pay, protection, and benefits, excellent working conditions. We need to make sure that our new national child care program truly creates universal, accessible child care, prioritizing the most vulnerable families. And we need well-paid workers here, the right infrastructure, and significant funding to match the need. And we need a big investment in care systems for seniors and people with disabilities, including assistance for families struggling with costs. In our own lives and in our own homes and spheres of influence, we need to proactively take steps to value care work and come alongside the women and gender diverse people so it's not a struggle. Are you doing this? Am I doing this? Please think about it carefully. We need progress on gender justice in leaps and bounds. We need to vote accordingly and tirelessly hold our leaders accountable to it too. In 2022, it's more urgent than ever. Our collective future must be a future of care. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jessica Johnson, Editor-in-Chief of the Walrus, and I'm so excited to be giving my first Walrus Talk. Over the years, I've seen some big presences on these stages, some household names, some youth I was just discovering for the first time. I learned something from all of them, and thank you for honoring me with your presence tonight. My topic is the future of journalism. It's a subject I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of different kinds of people about over the last few years. And to be honest, I knew I couldn't just come up here again and talk about how the media is dying. If you're here, you probably already know what some of the problems are. The first draft of my speech, I put in all the facts and figures about job losses and media outlets closing, and it was just so depressing, I had to tear it up. Instead, I'd like to talk about the challenges we face against the backdrop of other larger trends, because this is really the story about us and how society is changing. The first one is the polarization of knowledge. We've talked a lot in the last few years about political polarization and how the left and the right supposedly just can't talk to each other anymore. I don't think we're talking enough about the difference in the quality of the information we're sharing and receiving. As more media outlets die and areas across Canada become news deserts, as they're called now, there are two types of citizen emerging: those with access to high-quality, fact-based journalism, like the kind you can read in the Walrus, and those without that. You have people who pay for the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, The Globe, The Toronto Star, and of course the Walrus. But there's a huge category of journalism that might have some truth or value, but you can't trust it because it lacks transparency. Who reported it? How did they report it? Are they telling you that? I worry more about this category of poorly reported, or what we call unethical news at the Walrus, than I do about fake news. Because fake news I find relatively easy to spot. It's too fun. Poorly reported news is invisible, it's everywhere, and it's become normal. At worst, you have those who acquire sketchy knowledge on YouTube or in dark and sometimes secret corners of the internet. Like those recent protesters in Ottawa, some of whom thought COVID-19 vaccines are a conspiracy arising out of the World Economic Forum. I think, in truth, it's hard to find real reporting about what those people think. A factor in this change is the news deserts. Thousands and thousands of professional journalism jobs have been cut in the last decade in Canada, and local news has been the hardest hit. Which leads me to my second point. Our idea of the media is expanding so fast, and it's almost impossible to define it anymore. As journalists, we now think about how a single story is going to perform on 18 different platforms or apps, or just those platforms that are relevant to our own audiences. This talk could eventually end up as a TikTok, and it'll be going like that. My partner's young child can think of no better career, even though both his parents were trained in journalism, than becoming a YouTuber. If you don't know yet, YouTube is a platform that is a portal for your entertainment and your news and talking to your friends all at the same time. Why would you need the media? Gone are the days when the news had to be delivered by a specific kind of person, maybe a person in a suit, from a specific channel at a specific time and place, like the 6 o'clock news. A journalist is two people with a newsletter, a New York Times reporter, or some guy on Twitter, not every guy on Twitter. Sometimes the guy is all of those people. He's also got a podcast. You should check it out. I was thinking about Marshall McLuhan's quote that the media is the message, medium is the message. I'm not even sure that's the right statement for this era anymore. One thing all reliable media outlets have in common, though, is that it takes time and money to produce the good kind of journalism. Which brings me to my last point. I really don't want to be the person that just goes around saying this, but I'm going to be that person. We all need to get used to paying much more for content. Most of us pay shockingly little. A recent global study by the Reuters Institute in Oxford found that only 13% of Canadians pay for online news. More than a quarter of those paying subscribers support international publications, so not Canadian ones. I have read 17 free Guardian articles this month, and I know that because the Guardian is so good at counting them for me and asking for money. Every now and then I do flip them $5, but I can assure you as an editor that is not okay. Why do we think journalism should be free? Is it because it's so essential that, like hydro or heating, we expect that someone else will be taking care of it? The federal government recently announced Bill C-18, which is new legislation. It proposes to make tech platforms, like Meta and Google, compensate media outlets when people share the content we create. News, as you probably know, is a major driver of social media. These changes will help to offset some of the ad revenue that's been lost by the rise of the platforms. I can't lie, it sounds pretty good to me. But even if it kicked in tomorrow, I know it would cover only a fraction of the cost of what it costs to make journalism. Government intervention alone is not going to keep a healthy media industry alive. We all need to get used to paying more for content. It's the only way to keep our favorite outlets alive and maybe ensure that our not-so-favorite outlets are around for those who rely on them. Media may be a mostly private industry in this country, a handful of businesses trying to compete. But in fact, that's not true. The CBC is the country's biggest media outlet. If my colleagues see me say that, they'll fact-check me. But fact-based journalism as a whole, like our courts, libraries, government, nurses and teachers, all these same roles we've come to appreciate in the pandemic even more than usual, is what helps keep our society going. It means it's never been more important to think about what we need media for. Not everyone may want to read the Globe or follow the CBC. Some of my own family members believe the Walrus's articles are simply too long. But that doesn't mean they should have access to poor quality information. They should not be sent believing what sent those truckers to Ottawa. I believe some of this gap in understanding is the media's own failure to grasp what people value about us. When a lot of us talk about the value of journalism, we try to use big words. We talk about democracy or disinformation. Almost every media outlet has a democracy campaign. Supporting journalism has become a moral argument. We've branded what used to be essential as a luxury product, and I fear a class signifier. That's not what drives me to reach for my phone first thing in the morning, which is, of course, Wordle. But I look up the COVID-19 numbers in my area. What's the rise in inflation doing to real estate? Top 10 tips for working remotely. Are we really going to be working from home in a pandemic forever? These are not the questions of democracy, but they are the questions of people's lives. Democracy is what happens when everyone's life is working. The best way to ensure democracy's survival is to make sure everyone has equal access to information. We can't do that without the media, however and wherever you find it. Thank you.
Tanse, hello in Cree. Tapwe poko mio kisagao, it's a beautiful day. Cadmus nitisaka, my name is Chief Cadmus Delorme. I'm 40 years old, I look young as a chief. That's that reserve water I get to shower in every day. Today in this country, we inherited inherited a situation. As a First Nations person and as a chief and as a child of parents who attended a residential school, our work is cut out for us as Canadians. Today, we didn't create the Indian Act. We didn't create residential schools. We didn't create 60 Scoop. But as Canadians, we inherited that. And when you inherit something, you have a responsibility. In this country, starting in May of 2021, June last week, we have unmarked graves validation at former residential schools across this country. There's two things I have learned as a proud Canadian and as a proud Indigenous person. For Indigenous people, the unmarked graves is validation. Validation of the pain, frustration, anger, and tiredness of trying to remain Indigenous in a country that still somewhat oppresses. To my Canadian friends and family, that shield is down, admitting that I don't know enough about the truth between Indigenous people in Canada. In order to get the reconciliation, we must first accept and understand the truth. And why did it take unmarked graves at a former residential school for many Canadians to now put down our shield? It's because of the following. When it comes to truth, we must understand what our education system did in this country to put us in this moment of that gap of truth. I'm going to take us through generations. The baby boomer generation, our generation in this country where we're looking after them, they rely on us heavily. What did our baby boomer generation learn about the truth between Indigenous people? The truth is that our education system never talked about Indigenous people. What baby boomer generation learned was through Hollywood movies, the paint on the face, the horseback, living in teepees, the game Cowboys and Indians. And I just pre-warn you, if we play that game, the Indians usually win when I play. I'm just warning you. The baby boomer generation, that is what was learnt of the truth. Far from it. Residential schools were at an all-time worst. The physical, sexual, mental abuse was real. The Indian Act was implemented at the worst time during the baby boomers. Generation X, biggest decision maker generation in this country today. MPs, MLAs, mayors, for-profit, non-for-profit. Generation X is the biggest decision makers. What did they learn of the truth? The fact is that Generation X learned that the white paper was the best solution in 1969. Indigenous people, give up your rights, just be Canadian, move to the cities, get off the reserve. If anybody thinks that, please, you're wasting your energy. That is not the solution. Generation Y, I'm a Generation Y. What did we learn of the truth? We learned that, yeah, treaties happened. But somehow you agreed to live on reserve. Somehow you surrendered the land. Somehow residential schools and the Indian Act were a part of it. Today, our millennial generation and our Generation Z are bombarded with the truth. But the reality is there's no Indigenous Studies 100 class mandatory for Canadians for the prior generations. That is why it is so important that we must understand and accept the truth. The second part of truth is what happened to Indigenous people? Why are Indigenous people, we're not asking for pity, we're not asking for anybody to feel sorry for us, we're asking for Canadians to stand beside us and understand that we are healing. This is what happened. It's called intergenerational trauma. My great-great-grandmother, her English name was Gracie, born in 1870, never attended a residential school. Gracie got vertical lineage teachings from her mom and grandma, what this country promises every Canadian. My great-grandma Maggie, born in 1900, attended the Round Lake Indian Industrial School in 1906. She didn't get vertical lineage. She went into horizontal survival mode because of Canadian policy and residential school. The physical, sexual, mental abuse was real. Maggie went into survival mode with her sisters and her cousins. Maggie had my grandmother, Evelyn, second generation in my maternal side. Evelyn should have got vertical lineage teaching like everybody's promised in this country, but Evelyn didn't. She went into horizontal survival mode. Evelyn had my mom, Charlotte. Third generation. Charlotte should have got vertical lineage teachings. That's what this country promises, but Charlotte didn't. Charlotte went into horizontal survival mode. Charlotte had me. I never attended a residential school. My mother had to figure out how to be a mom while trying to figure out her locus of control on what she just went through and raise children in a country. Today, I have a 5-year-old daughter. My mom and my daughter are inseparable. I can tell you standing here that my vertical lineage is back. In this country, there are 1 million Indigenous people that have direct lineage to residential schools. In 2022, some are vertical lineage. I praise them and thank them. Some are at 45-degree angle. They're getting stronger. Some are still 100% horizontal survival mode. As Canadians, let's not give Indigenous people the solution. Let's stand beside Indigenous people in this country and ask them, what do you need to get back that vertical lineage? That is what we inherited as Canadians. What is the end goal of reconciliation? The end goal is the following. Couple months ago, my little girl and I were playing outside my house in Saskatchewan where I live. There was this plane in the sky. And my 5-year-old daughter said, "Dad, what is that?" Of course, when you tell a 5-year-old, they're going to ask why 5 or 6 times. I told her, "It's like a bus, my girl, but you drive it." She's like, "Can I drive it?" I was like, "Oh, you want to be a pilot?" "Absolutely, my girl, you'll be a pilot one day." I was driving to work, and I was thinking, oh, my little girl wants to be a pilot. I'm thinking, Mom, my little girl is an Indigenous. Did you know in this country in 2022, Indigenous females have to try twice as hard to reap half the benefits because of what we inherited? My wife and I have to try twice as hard for my daughter to be a pilot. When we reach full reconciliation, which I know we can if we all just take it a little more serious, one day my daughter will be a pilot. And I ask all of you to be an advocate to make that happen. Thank you very much.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Thank you so much to our talkers. I'd like to start with thanking Elamin, Abdelmahmoud, who I want to call post-Elamin moving forward. Dr. Fenwick, McKelvey, I'm tempted, if I was your student, to call you Professor of the Metaverse, but the good metaverse, possibly the metaverse for all. Dr. Shannon Lloyd, relative to everyone else, you were a great talker tonight. My takeaway, science-based targets, transparent, real, and big. Andrea, Gunraj, the 5 C's. I heard a big aha. That was new for the room. Let's not forget those. Also, women got us through the pandemic with little say and little pay. Jessica Johnson, I'm honored to be your colleague. Polarization of knowledge. Take a look, pay attention, see the gaps that exist. You made the case for journalism tonight. And Chief Cadmus, Delorme, the gap of truth, generation after generation. I think that brutal honesty is a shock and call to us all, but there's also hope that there is progress and an opportunity for us to stand with Indigenous people. And if you need any ideas on how to do that, they're outlined in the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Report. A round of applause for our talkers this evening. And thank you again to Concordia University. We couldn't do this work without your support. Now, what I'm going to do right now is invite our talkers in the front row to get up, and we're going to give them a moment to head to the reception before everyone else. So please, if you could, stand up and make your way outside. While you do that, I'm going to tell everyone else a little bit more about what we have coming up. If you enjoyed the Walrus Talks, IRL, in person, or online, Stay tuned for our fall season. The best way to stay in touch with us is to opt into our newsletter. You can do that by following the link in the email that you will receive following the event. Also, we have a table outside set up. You can just stop by. Also, get your hands on the Walrus. We encourage you to subscribe. You know I'm going to do this. I mean, my job is to hold this up and say, subscribe to the Walrus. We have a special for everyone here tonight. 8 issues delivered right to your door for $25. When you leave, there's a table, and just talk to someone at the table, and they'll get you sorted up. In turbulent times, it is crucial that reliable media remains available to everyone. And Jessica really outlined how big of an issue it is, especially coming out of the pandemic. We like to say that the walrus is a unique beast, not just because it's a silly-looking animal with a mustache and tusks, but because we're a registered charity in the Canadian media landscape. That means we depend on the support of our community of donors and sponsors. So if you enjoyed this event and the work we do, consider making a donation. All gifts of $20 or more qualify for a tax receipt. Thank you to Graham Carr, Joanne Pelletier, Philippe Beauregard, and everyone at Concordia for working with us on the event, as well to the team at the Walrus working hard behind the scenes. Thanks to our annual sponsors you see behind me, Air Canada, Inspire, Labatt Breweries of Canada, Meta, and Shaw. Community is really important, especially in these long COVID times, and each one of you is part of the Walrus. Thank you so much. We invite you, for those of you in the room, to join us in conversation in the reception, and everyone online, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll follow the conversation at #Walrus Talks. Have a good night.